Casey's Corner.
Casey's Corner.
Hey everyone, welcome to our channel. My wife and I are teachers and travelers who have recently moved to Belgium to work at an international school. In this episode, we're headed to Disneyland Paris and its sister park, Walt Disney Studios. The trip was a celebration of Allison's birthday, but this video will be an in-depth comparison of how the Parisian parks stack up against the two Disney parks in California. Right off the bat, Disneyland Paris hits you with its number one advantage over the OG Disneyland: space. No, I'm not talking Star Wars space, but actual physical land that comprises the parks. Disneyland Paris and its sidekick park, Walt Disney Studios, have over 30 more acres of land combined than that of Disneyland and California Adventures. The Parisian parks also have less rides and attractions, which doesn't really contribute to the fun, but it does help the space feel larger overall. The size difference is apparent even before you enter the park. This beautiful concourse welcomes visitors to Disneyland Paris, while this absolutely immense building serves as the ticket collection point. Once inside the gates, we get our first official comparison: the castle. Look, the less that's said here, the better. The Paris castle absolutely wipes the floor with the Californian one, both in overall appearance and in functionality. Obviously, it's bigger, we're learning that's not a surprise, but I'd also say that it's just outright better looking. The whimsical landscaping, the shape of the castle itself, make it feel as if it's been transported straight from a storybook. But even if the Disneyland Paris castle were somehow uglier than its Californian counterpart, it would still win out based on what's inside, and more importantly, below. Both the Disneyland and the Disneyland Paris castles are based on Aurora's home in Sleeping Beauty. In California, this is conveyed through an exhibit crammed into a hallway. You make your way up a narrow staircase to be presented with a series of dioramas depicting scenes from the movie. In Paris, not only can you go inside the castle, but you can go underneath it. The main room allows guests to move freely into Fantasyland, but it also features a sweeping staircase that brings you upstairs, where you can enjoy views of the park, as well as these stunning stained glass windows. But the real treat is the cave below the castle, where you come face to face with this magnificent, maleficent dragon. An absolutely amazing piece of animatronics. Definitely point to Disneyland Paris here. On to the rides. We started the day with Big Thunder Mountain. Based on nothing more than appearance, you'd give the win to the Paris version immediately. No questions asked. Their Thunder Mountain looms over a man-made lake and features impressively carved canyons and misshapen mountains. While it is missing a certain dynamite-chewing goat, the other animatronic animals are still here, as are many of the twists and turns from the California ride. They've added a dark section of track, however, that makes you feel as if you're hurtling through space, and is a breathtaking way to finish the ride. I'm a big fan of the original ride, but I think this version improves on nearly every aspect of it. Point for Paris. Next up, the Pirates of the Caribbean. I was nervous to ride this in Paris because the Californian version is my favorite ride in the park. I didn't want them to change everything and ruin the experience. These fears were alleviated immediately, as even the attention to detail in the theming of the queue far exceeded those of the original Disneyland, which often sees its lines spilling out onto the hot pavement of New Orleans Square. We climbed aboard a boat and were treated to a completely different opening to the ride, and by the time we splashed down into familiar territory, my decision had been made. This was a better Pirates. Nearly everything from the California version was here, from the distinctive smell of the water to those pirates having a gunfight surrounded by explosives. The Pirates of Paris has everything I loved about the ride in California, plus more, so it's with a heavy heart that I give the win here to Disneyland Paris again. Next up, Indiana Jones. The Paris version of this ride is nothing at all like the one in California, as it's a steel coaster with a loop and an overall ride time of just 1:15 seconds. I was tempted to pit it against the Incredicoaster, seeing as they're both roller coasters, and that kinda makes sense, but it also didn't feel fair in the slightest. At double the ride time with much more height and speed, not to mention better theming, which the Temple of Peril has none of, the Incredicoaster would easily smash the Parisian Indy. Instead, a more kind comparison would be to Goofy's Sky School, And even that isn't a clear-cut victory for Indy, as it's still a shorter experience by 30 seconds and just barely faster. Still, we'll give them the win. Speaking of the Incredicoaster, we'll just examine that next. And I think the fair comparison is to Walt Disney Studios' Avengers Assemble Flight Force. Besides having a mouthful of a name, Avengers Assemble Flight Force also features 3 loops and a top speed of 57 miles per hour. While I did enjoy the fact that the ride literally shoots you off immediately into a loop, almost before you even know what's happening, I did not enjoy that the whole thing was done in just over a minute. It's also kind of lame that the interior of the ride is another Space Mountain-like dark room filled with the occasional plasma TV mounted to the wall, which shows some kind of Marvel mumbo-jumbo as you careen past at 50 miles an hour. Compare that to the Incredicoaster, where you can look out over the entire park while enjoying a significantly longer ride. I'd say that even with only having a single loop, the coaster formerly known as California Screamin' is the much better experience. That's a point for the original Disneyland. While we're on the subject, we may as well jump over to Space Mountain now. I'll keep it short. The Space Mountain in Disneyland Paris is better in every way. It looks better on the outside, with its beautiful hyperspace cannon ready to shoot you to the moon. It looks better on the inside, with more thoughtfully placed screens to really amplify the action you're experiencing physically on the track. And lastly, it's just a better overall experience, with 3 loops and a ride time of over 2 minutes, all while being compared to the Space Mountain in Disneyland, which looks like it's housed in a circus tent and basically just turns continuously like you're being flushed down a toilet. This is a definite win for Disneyland Paris. The Haunted Mansion vs. the Phantom Manor is a closer affair, with both rides feeling pretty identical until the last room, which replaces the graveyard scene in California with a western ghost town in Paris. The change fits the theme of the Phantom Manor, as it is part of Disneyland Paris' Frontierland, but I'm not sure the western motif makes the ride better than the traditional graveyard finale. What seals the deal for me is that the Haunted Mansion in California has an annual transformation to the Nightmare Before Christmas, while the Paris Manor does not. This versatility is enough to edge the Haunted Mansion ahead in my book, but it was a close call.
Not a creature was peaceful, not even a mouse. The stockings, all hung by the chimney with cake.
Next up is the Crush Coaster, which features the longest line of anything at either park in Disneyland Paris. The single rider line for this was regularly at 40 minutes while we were there, with the normal standby line almost double that. It basically forces you to pay for the Fast Pass if you want to ride it, which is lame. It's a fun ride though, basically a combination of the Teacups and Goofy Sky School, with your car spinning freely as you fly across the steel track. There's no easy comparison to a ride at the parks in California, though I guess the closest would be one that no one really remembers is even at Disneyland anyway, Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin. This ride also lets the vehicle spin freely, but it does not feature any of the adrenaline-pumping dips and turns. It does, however, feature heavy theming, something that the Crush Coaster sorely is lacking in its main room, which basically just looks like a maze of steel track with lights bouncing all around, despite the fact that you're supposed to be ripping your way through an undersea current. At the very least, they should have made them blue lights or added bubbles, or spray you in the face with water or something, anything. I think Crush Coaster wins, but I also think not by much. Sure, it's a more intense ride, but it would also get destroyed by the actual roller coasters at the park. And if it's for kids, there's a case to be made that many more kids would enjoy the hilarious hijinks of Roger Rabbit more. Except for that one kid that was thrown out of the car that one time. We'll give the point to Disneyland Paris. Finally, let's look at the Ratatouille ride, which you just knew had to be in Paris. I have an unusual comparison to make here, and that's to Soarin' Around the World, formerly known as Soarin' Over California. Let me explain. The Ratatouille ride relies heavily on parking your car in front of an overly large 3D screen and then tilting the floor to match the events unfolding there. It's a level of immersion that feels very similar to that of Soarin'. What's more, there's a section in Ratatouille where they pipe in citrus smells as your car moves through an oversized kitchen pantry. The old Soarin' over California would use this exact same trick as you flew over orange groves. As for which one is better, Soarin's initial feeling of lifting off the ground and gliding over that massive screen is hard to beat. But those screens are also showing their age, and the ride can feel somewhat static once you're in the air. Ratatouille, on the other hand, keeps things moving constantly, throwing something new at the rider regularly, and definitely felt a lot more Disney, which is never a bad thing. I'll give the win to Walt Disney Studios and Disneyland Paris. So let's see, that brings our tally to Disneyland Paris having the better Space and Thunder Mountains, the better Pirates, points for Ratatouille, Crush Coaster, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Peril, and a better castle. I'll also give them points for their Alice in Wonderland hedge maze, and this wild RC attraction that was surprisingly intense for a Toy Story ride. I'll also give them a point for their pretty cool Cars Tastrophe Canyon ride that was kind of their Cars-inspired riff on the studio backlot tour. While the original Disneyland only scored points for the Incredicoaster and the Haunted Mansion. Looking at these scores, your first reaction may be to think that Disneyland Paris is the better park, but in reality, you'd be oh so horribly wrong. Sure, it wins out in a lot of the head-to-head battles, but it cannot keep up with the sheer number of rides that are housed in the California parks. Disneyland Paris also has no answer to the Matterhorn, Splash Mountain, Indiana Jones, the Jungle Cruise, the Tiki Room, the Mini Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, Monsters Inc., and many other smaller rides. It definitely cannot compete with Radiator Springs Racers, Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout, Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run, and Toy Story Mania. And it doesn't even want people to remember that Disneyland California just added a pair of the absolute best theme park rides ever built, with Star Wars Rise of the Resistance and Runaway Railway, the latter being the best ride I've ever been on at Disneyland. Disneyland Paris does have some more rides, but almost all of them are copies of those found in California, and are mostly the Fantasyland rides like Snow White and Peter Pan. Overall, it really is no contest. The original Disneyland is light years ahead of its Parisian partner, but that doesn't mean that we didn't have an absolute blast at the Paris parks. It was great to experience the differences between the parks firsthand, and at the end of the day, they still managed to bottle that Disney magic that keeps people coming back to the parks for decades. Also, Allison had an amazing birthday weekend, and in the end, that's all that matters anyway. Thanks for watching. Join us next time as we take you to Christmas markets all over Europe. Happy holidays!
There goes my wife. Swiping away. Oh, yeah, she realizes that she missed me. Oh.
Elles ont bien
Hey.
Iya lah, ulo dulu lagi.